So a high-impact behavior is defined as a specific dietary action that holds strong potential benefits for both human health and environmental sustainability. It is important to know that it's not just impactful in theory, it must also be realistic and socially acceptable in everyday life. So a high-impact behavior is something that can meaningfully improve health and reduce environmental impact while still being feasible for people to adopt within their cultural and local context. So to identify high-impact behaviors, researchers of different fields, such as sustainability experts and behavior scientists, collaborated to, first of all, compare current dietary habits with health and sustainability recommendations, and then identify the largest gaps between the current and the recommended intake. Then it was evaluated which behaviors would have the greatest combined health and environmental impact. And lastly, we also assessed the social acceptability and the feasibility within specific target groups. And then from a list of, I think in total, there were 40 high-impact behaviors, communities that later in the project implemented behavior change strategies around those high-impact behaviors, they could choose up to 5 high-impact behaviors. For example, the Spanish community, they chose eating 5 servings of fruit and vegetables per day, eating 3 servings of legumes per week, and limiting or avoiding red meat consumption. Some other examples of those high-impact behaviors are also limit the consumption of ultra-processed food products, or also know your energy, like caloric needs, and eat accordingly. Don't over or don't undereat. So as you can see, this is a very broad scope of high-impact behaviors that were formulated. And these behaviors, they were selected because they are impactful and also realistic for a local population. So high-impact behaviors, they directly connect human and planetary health, because many dietary patterns that would improve health, they also reduce environmental pressure. And in the development of the high-impact behaviors, the so-called planetary health diet was taken into consideration as a scientific reference framework for what a healthy and environmentally sustainable dietary pattern could look like at a global level. And for example, the planetary health diet emphasizes plant-based foods such as vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes and nuts, while recommending moderate consumption of animal source foods and limiting red and processed meat. So in practical terms, this means that increasing fruit and vegetable, for example, reduces the risk of chronic diseases and improves nutrient intake. At the same time, plant-based foods generally require fewer natural sources, generate lower greenhouse gas emissions compared to the animal products. So high-impact behaviors operationalize the idea what is good for human health is often also beneficial for the planetary health. So reducing meat consumption is a very important factor for ensuring the health of people and of the planet. From an environmental perspective, livestock production is associated with high greenhouse gas emissions. It requires large amounts of land and water, and it also contributes to biodiversity loss. From the health perspective, high red and processed meat consumption is linked to increased risks of cardiovascular disease, of diabetes type 2, and also certain cancers. So shifting from meat-centered plates toward plant-forward meals where legumes, whole grains, nuts and vegetables form the core, this supports both sustainability goals and long-term health outcomes of the population. So community plays a crucial role because eating is not just an individual choice. It is shaped by social norms, by availability, by traditions and shared practices. So within Plan Eat, the challenge was to move from a broad dietary framework, such as the planetary health diet, to concrete action that makes sense in everyday life across different countries and different communities. So in the project, we work with so-called living labs. That means local communities in different countries where researchers, healthcare professionals, food chain actors, and most importantly, citizens collaborate to test and to implement behavior change in real-life settings. For example, we work with Spanish adults over 40 years. We work with Polish children and teenagers. We work with Hungarian single parents. We work with elderly adults in Greece. So also, again, like the high impact behaviors were a broad scope, the living labs also represent a very broad scope of populations. And by working within these communities, we can ensure that high impact behaviors are culturally meaningful and socially acceptable. And community involvement also increases the ownership and the long-term adoption of a new behavior. So in Plan EAT, we think about leverage points for those high impact behaviors across 3 different levels, across the micro, the meso and the macro level. So the micro level focuses on individual consumers and the households in which they are involved. This includes factors such as physiological, psychological, socio-demographic factors, but also family, peers, the social networks. Then the meso level refers to the food environment that determines consumer decisions. This includes food supply and food chain actors. Or to put it in other words, it's what is available, affordable and promoted in everyday settings, such as in supermarkets and in canteens. And finally, the macro level comprises the broader food system and is shaped by political and economic factors, such as policies, pricing structures, including incentives or taxes, and marketing regulations. They all influence what kind of dietary behaviors are easier or are harder to adopt. And very important to note is that those leverage points for the high impact behaviors, they exist at all 3 levels. And sustainable change requires collaboration across these levels, because individual behavior change alone is just not enough if the surrounding food environment and the food system do not support it. And in Plan EAT, we therefore work across all levels to identify leverage points and to connect the different dimensions of the food system.